Good day, everyone. Welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship. Congratulations on making it to the Nationals. So, today, this round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, Article 9 of Japan's constitution has prohibited Japan from having an army or using military agents. From 2014, Japan's government, welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship, has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Nationals self-defense when an attack on an ally. This round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, Article 9 of Japan's constitution has prohibited Japan from having an army or using military Taiwan. From 2014, Japan's government, welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship, has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Nationals self-defense. This round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, Article 9 of Japan's constitution prohibited Japan from having an army or using military Taiwan. From 2014, Japan's government, welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship, has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Nationals self-defense. This round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, Article 9 of Japan's constitution prohibited Japan from having an army or using military Taiwan. In 2014, Japan's government, welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship, has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Nationals self-defense. This round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, Article 9 of Japan's constitution prohibited Japan from having an army or using military Taiwan. In 2014, Japan's government, welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship, has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Nationals self-defense. This round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, Article 9 of Japan's constitution prohibited Japan from having an army or using military Taiwan. In 2014, Japan's government, welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship, has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Nationals self-defense. This round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, Article 9 of Japan's constitution prohibited Japan from having an army or using military Taiwan. In 2014, Japan's government, welcome to round 3 of the NZ Schools Debating Championship, has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow Nationals self-defense. This round has an info slide. The info slide is, since World War II, I'm hoping I've made sure everything else is closed, so hopefully it should be better now. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's better now. Sorry for the inconvenience. I thank the speaker for their speech. As is customary, we reverse the speaking order, so I invite the neg leader to the floor.
This is a motion that assesses the interests of Japan. It is unclear what China's influence over Taiwan or Chinese influence over Japan tangibly means for Japanese citizens. We say, for Japan, it looks like better trade deals, a stronger workforce. They need to explain why we should care about their harms. 3 things in my reply today. Firstly, I want to talk about economics. Secondly, on international relations. Lastly, on security. Firstly, in terms of economics. Note here there's a path to victory for both sides of the house that can potentially win debate here, right? Because we claim that the Chinese economy is incredibly beneficial to Japan. I spent 10 minutes explaining to you why these benefits exist, why the incentives to have mutual trade exist, independent on diplomatic tensions. Where does this lie in the debate? Note here, to express a willingness to militarily intervene with against China means that 1, you express hostility and threaten to deploy ships in Chinese water, and 2, it means that Japan needs to actively distance itself economically and politically from China, and 3, I already explained to you why China has incentives to distance themselves. You do not want to be exporting into an economy that is funneling that resources into screwing you over militarily, right? All of which proves down the line that you get a decrease in economic and diplomatic ties with China. And how do we actually scale this, right? 1 is that if you do the weighing here, Chinese economy and the workforce probably exceeds the size of the Japanese economy and the Japanese workforce, right? Note here this relationship is therefore asymmetric, right? China can afford to cut off trade significantly with Japan and just export elsewhere in other BRI countries, or export to Australia and New Zealand, but Japan suffers a significant economic loss because their economy is so propped up by a lot of imports and has so much economic stagnation, right? Note here, let's talk about AF's claim on economics, right? They want to explain to you that trade shifts to the US and Japan, and US and Taiwan on their side of the house. 1, we already framed the US out. We explained to you that they're becoming increasingly isolationist, right? They do not want to operate at an even greater trade deficit. It's unclear why the US has an incentive to strengthen ties with foreign countries, anyways, right? But 2, in terms of Taiwan, A, we already explained to you down the line why trade agreements are just largely symmetric. B, even if you increase Taiwanese and Japanese interdependence, it is unclear why economic reliance on Taiwan is good in the first place. It's unclear as to why that actually wins the debate, because if you buy the material on Taiwan being incredibly unstable, it's just a bad trading partner to be interdependent on if your semiconductor imports are very inconsistent, and if the country you're exporting to is constantly under threat of an invasion, if you do believe their mechanisms, right? But C, even if you get an increase in trade from Taiwan, it is just outweighed by the potential trade you can gain from China, surely because of scale, surely because of economic capacity, right? Which means that we win this economics clash. Secondly, on international relations, right? 1, the US and the Western world will not increase trade with Taiwan because of diplomacy and stuff, right? And Christian and Hamish do the work and explain why this is true. But even if they do increase trade with the West, we told you why the West just sucks. It is just incredibly volatile. They're becoming increasingly isolationist. But 2, even if you do not take an interventionist stance, it is unclear as to how Chinese influence over Taiwan will A, ever happen and be justified under the Constitution, and B, tangibly impact Japanese citizens. We say these impacts don't exist. But in terms of the signaling effect, this is what is left standing if there is a deadlock in terms of likelihood of intervention on both sides of the house, right? 1, you signal hostility on side affirming. A, that is to China, which is very difficult to repair. Think historically during World War II, what happened between the two militaries, right? Think about the economies and the national security, right? The implications of that is just incredibly irreversible when you signal hostility to China. And B, you signal a breach of constitution to the entire world. And C, to the Japanese public, the public does not want war. They do not want to die. They do not want to see people, they do not want to see their soldiers deployed and getting killed on the battlefield, right? Lastly, in terms of security, because if you believe that Taiwan will not be invaded by China, none of their harms stand, even if an invasion occurred. On top of that, we explained that there are other actors that will defend Taiwan, and note here, this is why we win this debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I invite the opposing leader to come to the floor and close the statement.
not sure how close Japan is to China economically. What I do know is they're very intertwined with the United States. That is the best alliance that they can get themselves with. Once they have to prove with mental gymnastics that they can do all these benefits to try be able to align themselves with the Chinese alliance, I think that is the point at which it is extremely hard for them to mechanize why this is important. I think then 3 things to do in this speech. Firstly, on the likelihood of a China invasion and why it doesn't matter, even if that's marginally untrue. Secondly, on a subpart under that is Chinese and US incentives. Thirdly, on repercussions. And fourthly, on economic boost. Firstly, then, on the likelihood of a China invasion. We tell you that why this is particularly important, given the resources that Taiwan has and given the historical standing for them. They tell you that that's untrue for a couple of reasons. Even in their best case, where China is an incredibly great actor that really wants to present their world image on the stage, we tell you why they have like a vested interest. But even regardless, if they never sort of invade Taiwan, I think the reliance that the United States gets just from an alliance from them is just great, right? I think the United States still does not want to see China succeeding and still doesn't even want to have the risk of China ever invading Taiwan, at the point at which the US is now likely to back Japan because they think this is a great harm, right? And I think that's what's incredibly important here. I think we already go in depth to explain to you why the likelihood is so high. Even in our worst case, I think the intentions behind both of those countries are able to play out. Secondly, on repercussions. I think in their best case, where everything works out perfectly, I think you still have a scarcity of resources. What the benefit here with aligning with Western alliances is that there's just like hugely magnificent amounts of them. We tell you why you get that through the US alliance, but we tell you that there's also arising Asian alliances that have anti-China incentives. They never push back on this, right? We tell you why there's huge economies developing and wanting to trade with Japan. I think what we uniquely get is the stability that they cannot claim on their side, right? I think what is the exclusive benefit here, even at the point at which they had their best case run. I think you're able, because you now at least have some sort of like symbolic relationship, you're at least protected by your alliance to the United States, right? I think then it's unclear why tariffs are going to be impersonated to you by the United States, seeing as the commitment we've already seen with the United States-Japan relations currently. I think even in their best case, where these relations, I just don't think these relations are decreasing further. We already give you a lot of substantive material as to why these relationships are opening up and why Japan has demonstrated such an imperative to be able to commit to them. What does this mean then? We gave you a couple of harms on tariffs that has been misrepresented down the line. They tell you that the United States can just tariff anybody. I think that's untrue. They probably just have to have an incentive to be able to do so. I think it's highly unmechanistic of them to say that they're just going to tariff people. I think they care about having a stake and they want to like tariff people that aren't aligning with them super closely. Trump is not going to tariff you if you inflate his ego. Trump is probably going to tariff you if you tell them that you do not want to align with them and want to keep catering onto Chinese markets. That is the harm here. But then on the economic boost and repercussions, I think what we tell you is the opening up of markets, right? I think what they tell you is that there's essentially no expectation. We dispute this, considering the like substantial commitment made with US-Japan relations.
Thank the speaker for their speech. I thank both teams for a wonderful debate, and I invite you to cross the floor, shake hands, and then answer. Huh?